ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, Ambassador Volker. On behalf of the Danube Institute, I welcome you to this extremely timely conference on Ukraine after the elections. Though the conference would have been a timely and necessary one even if the sitting Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, had been re-elected on Sunday. After all, the Ukraine crisis offers the single largest threat of interstate violence in today's Europe. Nonetheless, the landslide election of Vladimir Zelensky, whose political experience is limited, has made our discussion today more urgent, more uncertain, and yet perhaps more hopeful too. An inexperienced president at a time of crisis heightens the many risks at hand. But the arrival of a new broom also means that some of the failed and perhaps rigid policies of the past can be swept away more readily. Much will depend, therefore, on those to whom the new president turns to for advice, at home and abroad. I think that we here today are first out of the starting gate in the race to give advice to the new president. And in due course, perhaps, we'll send a video of this event to President Zelensky. I should perhaps say that this is not the first time that the Danube Institute has been quick off the mark to contribute to the international debate on Ukraine. In welcoming guests to our events, I like to introduce the Institute as a center-right think tank that believes nonetheless in vigorous and open debate with our respectable democratic rivals on the center-left. But also, in addition, we are a transmission belt for people and ideas within Central Europe, within the whole of Europe, and in particular, perhaps our unique selling proposition, between Central Europe and the English-speaking world. In our role as a transmission belt of ideas and people, we have held conferences in all three partnership regions, most recently in London 2 weeks ago on the worldwide persecution of Christians and other believers. That, of course, has since become a tragically topical issue. But the first conference we held outside Hungary was in Washington in partnership with the Hudson Institute on how the West should respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. That took place on the 31st of March 2014, less than a fortnight after the early first Russian aggressions. As on this occasion, we were responding to a dramatic change in the situation. Our initial planning for that conference had focused on how the V4 countries could perhaps cooperate diplomatically and economically to assist the new Ukrainian democracy to stabilize itself and to avert the Russian coup de main that then happened in February, albeit in light green disguise as we were still planning. I well recall a conversation with Paula Dobryansky, Ambassador Volker's sometime colleague, in which we had to switch speakers and topics around quite ruthlessly in order to concentrate more on preserving Ukraine intact and free against Russia than on averting a crisis that had just erupted, has continued, changed its character at times, but that shows no signs of going away or being peacefully settled. I watched that 2014 conference recently. I recommend the video to you on our website. It's realistic, practical, and without illusions. And for those reasons, it is not exactly optimistic. And its realism has been borne out by events since then. The constant Russian military pressures. The resistance of a Ukrainian army that is bleeding but increasingly well-armed and effective. The struggles to keep the West united in imposing effective sanctions on Russia. The differences between NATO member states on what kind of effective weaponry to supply to Ukraine. The backsliding by some NATO members on economic matters like Nord Stream 1 and 2. The instability of Ukrainian politics, the failures of reform, and perhaps of an inadequate anti-corruption program. The surely avoidable clashes between Ukraine and its neighbors, including Hungary, on ethno-cultural questions, and now finally the election of an inexperienced actor as president, which, however it turns out, inevitably gives an impression of lack of seriousness in democratic politics. The comparison is a very inexact one, but we might recall that in transatlantic politics and East-West relations, actors have sometimes performed very well. Indeed, President Reagan once said that he couldn't see how anyone could be a good president without being an actor. So President Zelensky can claim that he has one of the main qualifications for the job. At the Institute, we have kept a watching brief on the development of Ukrainian politics and the Ukraine crisis since that first conference. Our conference, for instance, have included a major one on the defense of Central Europe that we held in partnership with NATO 3 years ago. In general, it is our task in foreign policy to preach a kind of realistic Atlanticism. Disraeli, the great 19th century British statesman, once said that a majority is the best repartee. Well, I sometimes have to say to my Central European friends who are angry at some remarks or criticisms from President Trump that the best repartee for them would be to raise expenditure on defense up to 2% of GDP. That would silence their critics. But I would especially like to draw your attention to the articles on the various aspects of Ukrainian politics and the crisis with Russia in our sister magazine, the Hungarian Review, available here today by Geza Jasenski, a distinguished historian and experienced diplomat, and the first foreign minister of Hungary after the changes of 1988-89. Minister Jasenski brings a vast knowledge of history and a practical experience of diplomacy to bear on helping us to understand the agonies of the present and the potentialities of the future for Central Europe. We're delighted to see him here today. We're also delighted to see diplomats from so many countries present. It would push this introduction to an even more unwieldy length if I were to list them all, but you will understand if I make 2 exceptions. May I welcome in particular the Ukrainian ambassador, Ms. Lyuba Nepop, and hope she finds our coverage and debate fair and accurate, and also the American ambassador, Mr. David Kornstein, who will be here during our debates but has to leave at some point during them. Thank you for coming, both of you. I will leave it to my colleague, Naomi Karani, our executive director, who has done most of the heavy lifting to organize this conference. I will leave it to her to introduce the speakers on the panel, an exceptionally distinguished one, each one of whom is really important in some of the topics we are discussing. It remains to me to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Kurt Volker, who is a leading expert in US foreign policy and national security policy with some 30 years of experience in a variety of government, academic, and private sector capacities. Now, you will see, along with the other speakers, that Mr. Volker, his career is laid out very clearly. But I want to make 2 particular points. First, he is a senior member of the Republican side of the US foreign policy establishment, who has served in many important capacities, and I think it's fair to say would hold a leading foreign policy position in any Republican administration. And secondly, he is one of the relatively few US Democrats today who are very well versed in this particular region. This region was once a major aspect of US foreign policy in the Cold War. That tended to be forgotten shortly afterwards, but he particularly has kept, so to speak, kept the faith with this region and with its changing politics. Now, he is, therefore, and you may choose your metaphor, in the engine room, at the coal face, inside the whale, on the question of the question of the crisis in Ukraine and the negotiations that are being held to improve its situation. Since, in July 2017, he was appointed US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. We can therefore, I think, say to ourselves, we are about to hear from someone who, with the possible exceptions of Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and President Trump himself, knows more about US policy and activities in relation to Ukraine than any other. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate that. Jó reggelt kívánok, nagyon örülök, hogy itt lehetek, és nagyon örülök, hogy olyan sok régi barátot látok itt. Köszönöm szépen, hogy eljöttek. Ez egy nagy tisztelem számomra is. I understand my task is to speak in English here, so I will do it. With heavy heart, because it would be delightful to speak directly to everyone in Hungarian. I would, and let me also say thank you to Noe for the invitation and persisting in inviting me to come here. Noe and I worked together 25 years ago and have remained in close touch and close friends ever since. What I would like to do this morning is start out by giving some context. There's a lot of current news to talk about. Things that have been happening in elections in Ukraine and Russian policy and so forth. But I want to start with context. And then I'll turn to what some of the current situation looks like today, and then a few comments about some of the current events, if that's an acceptable way forward. But starting with the context, as John mentioned, I lived in Hungary in the mid-90s. I worked substantially on NATO enlargement issues here and across Central and Eastern Europe. I was involved in the first round of NATO enlargement from here. I worked for Senator McCain in 1997 to 1998 when the first round, Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic, had to go through the U.S. Senate. And so we ratified the membership of these countries into NATO through the U.S. Senate. I then worked for Lord Robertson at NATO. I helped develop the Membership Action Plan. I then worked at the National Security Council, where we then developed the plan for the Prague Summit, where we then brought 7 new countries into NATO: Baltic states, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. I then continued to push on that. We went through the Riga Summit, and then in 2008, we made a commitment to Georgia and Ukraine, and we extended membership offers to Albania and Croatia, and we've stuck with it since then. And I'm delighted that Montenegro has formally joined already and that North Macedonia is on its way. So that's been some of my experience and trajectory with the region, and in the course of that, having visited and traveled to all of the various countries here. Hungary is a special place, and I know that from my time here. Hungarians came here over 1,100 years ago as a distinct people, a distinct language, a distinct culture, a distinct journey that brought them here. And they faced challenge after challenge after challenge, being here in the Carpathian Basin, to maintain that integrity of Hungarian identity, Hungarian language, Hungarian culture, Hungarian state, and faced many attacks on this, sometimes occupation, sometimes loss of territory, whether it is from the Tatar invasions or the Turks for 150 years with the crown of St. Stephen buried in the ground, or whether it is revolutions that were put down in the 1700s or in 1848, put down by Austria and Russia, or the upheavals in 1920, or again, after World War II, the Russian occupation, the Soviet occupation, the presence of Soviet troops on Hungarian soil for so long, the inability of Hungary to retain its rightful place as a historic nation of Europe. This is what has shaped and fused Hungarian identity over centuries. And there is nothing more important, as I know from my Hungarian friends, than the maintenance of that identity, especially against the existence of external threats over such a period of time. It may sound strange to say it this way to a Hungarian audience, but that's actually one of the great strengths of Hungary, that it has had the opportunity to forge and curate this identity of being Hungarian and to protect it over time. I bring all of this up because I want you to think about that and keep that in mind as we look at Ukraine today, because that is what Ukraine is going through. There is a nation of Ukrainians. They have a national identity. It is a country that has faced challenges and attacks and changes of borders and movements and infusions of different groups of people many times over the centuries. Hungary might be a country that starts with a Hungarian core, but then has Kun and Serb and Horvat and Slav and Roma. The same with Ukraine, having Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Tatars. It's a mixture, but it's also a country, and it's also an identity. And there was still perhaps some ambivalence or some lack of clarity after the end of the Cold War as Ukraine emerged from 70 years of occupation by Russia, not just, and more than that going back over time, not just the 40 years that Hungary experienced under the Soviet Union. Still a little bit of lack of clarity about the strength of this national identity and what it means and where the soul of the country was. But Ukraine, again, has faced external aggression in the form of Russia's attacks and seizure of Crimea and claimed annexation of Crimea, and attacks and continued occupation and continued fighting in eastern Ukraine to this day. And this has helped forge and strengthen a sense of Ukrainian identity as a nation. It has helped solidify the commitment to democracy, the commitment to being part of the West, the commitment to an orientation toward Europe and toward NATO. And this is something that Ukraine is struggling with every day. It is still under attack. It's the one quibble I would have with John's very kind introduction was that he talked about Ukraine as the place where there is the threat of interstate conflict in Europe. That's not true. It is the one place where there is ongoing interstate conflict in Europe, and we can't forget that. And as a result of that, and especially thinking about Hungary's identity and Hungary's history, I think we all should feel an obligation to stand with Ukraine to help them to strengthen their country, to reinforce that sense of Ukrainian identity that is inclusive and that builds a democratic, prosperous, reformed, secure state as a part of a European family. I think we've all lived through different aspects of this in different countries. We all believe that Ukraine deserves the same opportunity as all of the rest of us have had. So that's a bit of the context that I wanted to give. Now let's turn to the situation today. Ukraine has had more success in implementing reforms since the Maidan, since 2014, than in the preceding 20 years. It has made a lot of progress on democratic institutions, on the judiciary, on fighting corruptions, on the economy, on security sector reform, rebuilding the military. Much more progress than the preceding 20 years. However, it still has a long way to go. It is deeply affected by an oligarchic state where a handful of people have a disproportionate share of the wealth and the control of the economy and the influence that that creates in politics, in the judiciary, and in the governance of the country. That's a handicap for Ukraine. Ukraine also faces external aggression, and so this, again, puts enormous pressure on the society. It faces a lot of the same challenges that others in this part of the world face as well, in everything from good governance to how to ensure a free media given media owners who have political points of view themselves. How do you ensure diversity and freedom of the press in a media environment where financial pressures drive it towards those with money who have then points of view to put forward. It faces problems with governance, and it faces problems with corruption. It has enormous challenges. That doesn't mean it is not worthy of further support. Quite the contrary. It means we need to double down and be as helpful as possible to help Ukrainians find their own way through these many challenges. Another aspect to the current situation today is that they are facing this external aggression from Russia. Russia, as you know, has invaded and occupied parts of Georgia. It continues to occupy parts of Moldova. It is now doing so with Ukraine. And it is an effort by Russia to hold countries back from realizing their own aspirations. We from the United States, or we from NATO, from Western Europe, firmly believe that people should have the right to choose their own orientation. This is enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act from 1975, that countries should have the right to choose their own orientation. There should be no threat or use of force. There should be no change of borders by force. These are all principles that underpin security and stability in Europe. They've served us well over many decades. These are principles that are now being flagrantly violated in the case of Ukraine. And if we allow that situation to be as it is, we are actually doing a disservice to security in Europe at large. We are increasing the risks that it will be threatened elsewhere, and we are abandoning our own principles in our beliefs in the rights of people to choose their own destinies and their own orientation. We can't make Ukraine a great nation. Only Ukrainians can do that. But we ought to be upholding the rules of the system that give Ukrainians the time and the space in which to do that. Another part of the bigger picture today is Russia has gone from a experiment with democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union to a consolidating state to what is now genuinely an authoritarian state with a single ruler, a single party, with a lack of political pluralism, and with a policy of external aggression which is used by that authoritarian leadership to justify its continued rule. It is an empire mentality as opposed to an empowerment mentality. And I think that describes the fundamental difference of Russia's approach to Ukraine as opposed to the approach of the United States or the West. Russia does not want to see a successful Ukraine. They do not want to see a stable and secure Ukraine, and they continue every day to put pressure on that Ukrainian state. We all want the best for the Russian people. We want to see Russians enjoy the same benefits of freedom, of economic reform, of opportunities for growing prosperity that reaches the majority of the people, longevity of life and health standards and standards of living. We want the best for the Russian people. Unfortunately, they live in a system that will not produce that for them right now. So when we talk about Russia and Russia's aggressive policies toward Ukraine or others, it's not a statement about the Russian people. It's a statement about state-level aggression against other states and other peoples in Europe, something that we firmly oppose. The best hope for security in Europe, stability in Europe, prosperity in Europe, for the realization of our fundamental freedoms and democratic values is for Russia to reform as well. We would hope such a reform would come from inside, that it would be sustainable, and that it would be peaceful. That is our ambition. I hope someday that happens. That is more likely to happen. It is more likely to produce a better Russia and a better Europe if Ukraine is successful today. Now let's turn to a few of the current issues, and one that I think is important to address in Hungary is the role of national minorities in Ukraine and the rights of people to speak Hungarian as a native language, to have education in that language. We stand behind the rights of national minorities to express their identities, to speak their own language, to have education in that language. It is a principle that is enshrined through many documents, both the Helsinki documents and the follow-on to that through the OSCE. It's enshrined in the Charter of Paris of a New Europe. It is part of the Council of Europe's perspective. National minorities have rights. At the same time, it is reasonable for a state to want all of its citizens to speak the national language. That is also something that is quite expectable. This does not create a zero sum. These aspirations of national minorities and national governments can be achieved. And we have urged both in Ukraine and urged here in Hungary for the two governments to work together on ways in which to see that these mutually agreeable principles can be realized. Unfortunately, that has not worked out to the present. I believe it can be done. There are dozens of examples around Europe of places where national minorities are able to have education in their own language, to have proof of competency in the national language, and to do this in a harmonious way. I hope that this can be achieved with Ukraine as well. We have recently seen the election in Ukraine of President Zelensky. President Zelensky, as you may know, is not a native speaker of Ukrainian. He has learned Ukrainian. He is a native Russian speaker. I hope that he is able to look at all of the national minorities in Ukraine as people of equal worth and able to deal with their aspirations and find ways to, in a technical way, in a pragmatic way, address the issues of language and national minority rights. And in doing so, I hope it clears the way for Hungary to express the kind of support for Ukrainians and Ukrainians' identity and nationhood and statehood that Hungary should be supporting as its own, as a reflection of its own experience and its own history as a nation here in the Carpathian Basin. One of the particularly troubling issues, and especially for someone who has served as ambassador to NATO and worked on NATO issues for so long, is to see Hungary obstruct meetings of the NATO-Ukraine Commission at the ministerial level because of the lack of resolution of this national minorities question, the language question. I firmly believe that the national minority language issue is important and needs to be resolved between the two countries. I do not believe that this provides any justification for blocking the NATO-Ukraine discussions when we have to look at the bigger picture and the bigger context that I talked about before, the implications for the security and stability of Ukraine, the implications for European security, the implications for the future of Russia. I think it is self-defeating for Hungary to put itself in the position of obstructing this NATO-Ukraine dialogue. I think friends of Hungary, such as the United States, need to work with Hungary and Ukraine to overcome the language obstacle, and separately, but affirmatively, we also need to be working together on security and stability of Ukraine and in Europe generally. The final point I would like to make, I'll wrap up and then we'll go to the panel discussion, is that the conflict in Ukraine continues to go on. Every day there is mortar fire, there's artillery fire, there is sniper fire. Every week Ukrainians are killed. This is done under the complete control of Moscow. Russia controls all of the military forces that are in eastern Ukraine. They provide the equipment, they provide the intelligence, they provide the command and control, they provide the financing, they pay for the contract soldiers. They handpick the leadership of the two puppet political entities that they created there, the Luhansk People's Republic, as it's called, and the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. They finance those establishments. They don't finance them well, not lavishly, but that's the only financing that they get. They have destroyed the lives of 4 million people, all of them Russian speakers. The people whom Russia claims to support have seen their lives destroyed by this Russian-directed conflict. Nearly 2 million of them have left, most to the west of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, or further west to Germany or Poland, some to Russia. The remainder are facing extraordinary humanitarian challenges in every way imaginable. It is mostly older people. It's mostly pensioners who remain behind. Younger people are afraid of being pressed into military service by the occupying authorities, or women are afraid for their security, and they've all left. They try to send money back. There has been a severe disruption to the local economy. Most of the major sources of economic wealth that had been there are gone: coal, steel, mining, etc., all in disrepair. You see tremendous environmental damage as a result of the shutdown of heavy industry, flooding of mines, contamination of these, even some radioactive materials. You see a significant portion of the population living in food insecurity, which the UN defines as providing a disproportionate share of your income, over 50%, just to buy food. There are threats to water supplies, and the Donetsk water filtration plant sits on the ceasefire line and is often under pressure of being shut down. The pipes that lead from the power plant are therefore also often under threat. Crews have been fired on as they've been going to work at the water filtration plant. You see pressure on the healthcare system. You see a form of drug-resistant tuberculosis that has spread among portions of the population there. You see shutoffs of electricity. You see threats to energy supplies. You see cell phone service being shut off, which may sound like a luxury, but the reality is it's a principal means of people to be able to communicate. Probably most significantly, you see severe disruptions of freedom of movement. There is unexploded ordnance, there are landmines, there are a few channeled routes that people can use to move about, and particularly to get out of there to the rest of Ukraine across dangerous boundary crossing points. This is an unacceptable humanitarian situation, and it is just a few hours flight, a few hours drive, really, from here. If you drive from Budapest, I'm just doing my math, I'm guessing you could get there in maybe 12 hours. This is a horrific humanitarian situation. It's one that should concern all of us, and it is one that should and must be resolved. The Minsk agreements are the framework that has been agreed for doing so. Ukraine has passed preliminary legislation to do its share of the Minsk agreements. It is always offering, put on the table, they want to have a ceasefire. We have not seen Russia take seriously its responsibility for implementing the Minsk agreements, and indeed Russia denies that it has any responsibility and urges that there be a direct discussion between the government in Kiev and the two so-called People's Republics that they control. This ought to be a matter of grave concern. The government and the new president of Ukraine deserve our support in seeking to end the conflict peacefully, to restore normality to the lives of these people. I believe the best way to do this is for a UN peacekeeping mission to deploy on a temporary basis to create a transition mechanism from Russian control to eventual Ukrainian control. But we need to keep this clearly in focus, and we need to continue to hold Russia accountable for its actions in creating this conflict, including through the continued maintenance of sanctions in the European Union, through our support for Ukraine in defending itself, and through all of our bilateral and other engagements with Russia to let them know that this is not an acceptable way for any of us for Russia to behave in Europe. I will pause with that. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Kurt. Can you hear me? First, just on a practical note, this panel will be bilingual, so if you do not understand both languages and do not have your headphones, please try to adjust them. Thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see this room full of so many friendly faces. This is an exceptional panel, and I'm very excited about this whole discussion that we are about to hear. It's also exceptional for me personally because I have some very old ties to some of the panelists. Kurt has already mentioned that exactly 25 years ago he was my first job in my first full-time job, first boss in my first full-time job at the US Embassy, and he taught me how to write. We wrote our first cable on the lead-contaminated paprika scandal in Hungary, and it was called Hungarians Get the Lead Out. So we'll see whether Ukrainians can do that now and really get going on the reforms. So I really have very nice memories of that time. And my other boss is Zsolt Németh, my other former boss, from whom I also learned a lot, especially during the numerous talks or meetings that I sat through with him. And I always admired him for keeping calm, but always saying what he thought he should say without bearing his word or offending the other side. And I'd like to introduce the panel. Kurt has already been introduced. Laszlo Brenzovich is a member of the Ukrainian parliament. He's, I think, the only ethnic Hungarian in the Ukrainian parliament. He's also president of the Cultural Association of Hungarians in Subcarpathia. Subcarpathia, for those of you who are not from Hungary, is Transcarpathia. It's just the question of where you stand. He's a member of the Committee on Human Rights, National Minorities and Interethnic Relations in the Verkhovna Rada. He teaches at the Ferenc Rákóczi Transcarpathian Hungarian College. He holds a PhD in history, and he's the author of numerous studies and books. Kalman Mizsei is he's been everything basically. He was head of mission at the European Union Advisory Mission, head of mission at the European Union Advisory Mission on Civilian Security Sector Reform in Ukraine. And he knows Ukraine inside out, and I really expect him to bring us this on-site knowledge. He established that mission, and he has played a key role in all of those reforms that Kurt has mentioned in his introduction or keynote speech about the security reforms and human rights strategy, etc. He was also European Union Special Representative for the Republic of Moldova, and he was Assistant Secretary General of the UN and UNDP's Regional Director for Europe and the CIS. So I think there are not many people who know more about this region. Zsolt Németh was a founding member, or is a founding member of Fidesz, and he has served as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He has been serving since 2014, but he used to serve before that for 8 years, and he also served twice as political state secretary or parliamentary state secretary at the foreign ministry. He also plays a key role in Hungary in the NGO world regarding minorities. He is the founder of the Pro Minoritate Foundation. So in this regard, he can talk not only about official Hungarian-Ukrainian relations, but also about Hungarian minority policy. Damon Wilson is Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council, where he's responsible for programs and strategy. So I think he can have a very important contribution from the think tank scene. He has also a great deal of experience in all transatlantic fields. He served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council, and he has held various positions in the US Department of State. So I'm very glad that we have I think each member of this panel can bring us a different viewpoint. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments on Kurt's keynote, and also maybe a general evaluation of what you think about the elections. As we know, a president has been elected that we don't know much about. President Poroshenko called him a candy wrapper, which I find particularly funny because Poroshenko must know a thing or two about candies, but it's anyway. So he hasn't really said much about his program, and but in spite of that, he has been greeted also by the Hungarians in Subcarpathia, and I'm really curious about the grounds of this joy, whether you know more than we do, and also about your expectations for the reforms of you. So what you base your expectations on, given that he has not said much about his program. So we can start maybe a bit with László.
Köszönöm szépen. Tisztelt miniszter úr, nagykövet urak, nagykövetasszony, 3 dologról szeretnék beszélni. Az első az, hogy 5 perccel ezelőtt 278 szavazattal az ukrán parlament elfogadta a nyelvtörvényt. De beszéljünk először a választási eredményekről. Választási eredmények tulajdonképpen nem voltak meglepőek, hiszen a közvéleménykutatási adatok folyamatosan azt mérték, hogy az ország lakosságának a döntő többsége, 2/3 elégedetlen az ukrán elnök és az ukrán kormány által folytatott politikával. Egy fél évvel ezelőtt még Poroshenko elnök úrnak a népszerűsége 5-6%-on állt, viszont az elutasítottsága az folyamatosan 50% fölött volt. Úgyhogy amikor a célegyenesbe került a dolog, akkor csak az volt a kérdés, hogy sikerül-e elnök úrnak bejutni a második fordulóba, illetve az, hogy ki fog vele együtt bejutni a második fordulóba. Azt hiszem, hogy a szakemberek, a szociológusok többsége azt, hogy ő a második fordulóban vereséget fog szenvedni, az nem volt kétséges. Persze Ukrajnában mindig is a választásokon azért az adminisztratív erőforrások is jelentős szerepet játszanak, most is játszottak, de ezeknek az adminisztratív erőforrásoknak a maximuma az olyan 8-10%-ban mérhető, semmiatt ugye az volt valószínűleg az, hogy Poroshenko nem fog nyerni. Viszont az, hogy ki fog bejutni a második fordulóba, az igen sokáig kétséges volt. Nyilván Poroshenko számára a legjobb ellenfél az Bojko lett volna, hiszen akkor az országnak a megosztottságát újra fel lehetett volna használni arra, hogy esetleg győzön. Mindenki Timosenkóra számított, Timosenko nem jutott be a második fordulóba elsősorban azért, mert tulajdonképpen a elvekben, és nem igazából lehetett megkülönböztetni azt, hogy miben akar ő mást, mint Petro Poroshenko, és emiatt ugye az állampolgárok ezt büntették. Az, hogy ugye egy tapasztalatlan vezető került, vagy pedig egy politikai tapasztalattal nem rendelkező vezető került mégis megválasztásra, azt hiszem, hogy ez most már a világban eléggé trendszerű, gondoljunk csak Szlovéniára, de ugye, vagy pedig Szlovákiára legutóbbi választásokon, ahol szintén olyan személyek kerültek a hatalomra, akik nem volt politikai tapasztalatuk, úgy látszik az emberek döntő többségének az establishmentből és annak a politikájából elég ele van, és az ilyen dolgokhoz is vezethet. Másrészt pedig ugye már meséltem itt a barátaimnak, volt egy nagyon érdekes dolog Oroszországban, Uszcilimszk városában, ahol a helyi hatalompárt az minden potenciális jelöltet eltávolított az útból, hogy a regnáló polgármester nyerjen. Emiatt egy 27 éves háziasszony indult, és 70% 30-ra megnyerte a választásokat a polgármesterrel szemben. Itt is egy hasonló dologgal vagyunk szemben. Ami viszont nagyon fontos, és szerintem befolyásolni fogja Ukrajna jövőjét, az a választási térképnek a megváltozása. Hogyha nézzük 1990-től a választási eredményeket az elnökválasztásokon, akkor azt láttuk mindig, hogy van egy délkeleti blokk, aki általában az orosz nyelvűeknek a jelöltjére adta le a szavazatokat. Ezek különbözőek voltak. Először az orosz nyelvűek jelöltjek volt, vagy a választó Kravcsuk elnök Csornovillal szemben, majd Kucsma Kravcsukkal szemben, majd ugye Juschenko, majd később a más jelöltek, és ez mindig látszott az, hogy van egy nyugat és közép-Ukrajna, aki a nyugatos jelöltre szavaz, és van egy délkelet-Ukrajna, aki általában inkább az orosz irányultságot, vagy pedig a másképp viszonyulást az identitáshoz jelképezte. Most teljesen más volt az első fordulónak a végeredménye. Ugye volt egy a Bojkóra leszavazó, az orosz irányultságra leszavazó 2 megye, Donetsk és Lugansk megye, és volt Lemberg vagy Lvov megye, aki Poroshenkóra szavazott. Poroshenko összesen az összes megyei közül csak 2 megyébe ért el többséget. Összes többi a zöldbe borult, ami mutatja azt, hogy az ország lakossága döntő többsége a 2 szélsőséget nem kívánja választani, hanem egyfajta centrista politikára számít. Ez második alkalommal bebizonyosodott különösen a második fordulóban, hiszen a második fordulóban Poroshenko csak egyetlen megyébe, Lemberg megyébe ért el többséget. Emellett részesen azt mondták, hogy most már Ukrajnában 2 LNR van a Luganszki népköztársaság és a Lembergi népköztársaság, amelyek így egymásnak az antipódusai. Nyilván nehéz lesz az átmenet, hiszen Zelenszky úrnak parlamenti frakciója nincs, parlamenti pártja sincs, viszont jellemző az ukrán politikára az, hogy az ő pártja, a nem létező Népszolgálja című pártot már 35% népszerűséggel mérik, pedig azt se tudja a választópolgár, hogy kik a tagjai és hogy milyen programmal fog indulni. Aggodalomra ad okot az, hogy a nyelvtörvény elfogadása mellett az, hogy ma a parlament tárgyalni fogja azt is, hogy szűkítsék az elnöki jogkört. Így próbálván ugye eleve egy olyan fait accompli helyzetet teremteni az új elnök számára, hogy ne tudja még azt a korlátozott jogköret sem használni, ami rendelkezésre áll. Reméljük azt, hogy nem fog átmenni, vagy ha át is megy, ez teljesen nyilvánvalóan alkotmányellenes, hiszen az alkotmány rögzíti az elnöknek a jogkörét. Az is igaz, hogy az alkotmány rögzíti a nyelvi jogokat is, amit a nyelvtörvény nem vesz figyelembe. A nyelvtörvény elfogadása. Hagyományos ukrán módon történt a nyelvtörvénynek az elfogadása, mert ugye megtárgyaltunk 2400 módosító indítványt, a 2400 módosító indítvány közül egy sem lett támogatva, viszont tegnap éjjel a parlamentnek a kulturális bizottsága ülésezett, és állítólag ezen a kulturális bizottságon valami fajta módosításokat elfogadtak a nyelvtörvény vonatkozásában. Ezt 5 perccel a végszavazás előtt osztották szét a parlamenti képviselőknek. Tehát tulajdonképpen azt, hogy mi van a nyelvtörvényben, azt akkor fogjuk megtudni, amikor az újságok ezt majd le fogják hozni. Minden esetben mindenfajta kérésünk és az Európai Tanács kérése és számos politikus kérése ellenére a választások előtt, a parlamenti választások előtt került sor a nyelvtörvény elfogadására, amit valószínűleg, ahogy ígérte is, Petro Poroshenko még hivatalban lévő elnök alá fog írni. Ami tulajdonképpen azt jelenti, hogy megint csak ugyanazt a társadalmat megosztó fegyvert kívánják használni a parlamenti választások előtt, hiszen erről fog szólni a parlamenti választás, hogy ki van a nyelvtörvényben, ki van ellene. Egyébként a nyelvtörvénynek a tartalma az összes nyelvi oktatási jognak a felszámolását jelenti. Az elnevezés az, hogy az államnyelvről szóló törvény, de valójában a többi nyelvnek a betiltásáról van szó. Különösen néhány abszurd dolog az, hogy például újságokat úgy lehet majd nyomtatni, például magyarul vagy más nyelven, románul, hogyha ugyanazt ukránul is kinyomtatjuk ugyanazon példányszámban, ami tulajdonképpen a kisebbségi sajtónak a halálát jelenti. Az oktatási jogokon eltérően az ígéretekről, hogy a Velencei Bizottságnak az ajánlásait figyelembe fogják venni, szigorítanak az oktatási jogokon, és még szűkebbre szabják azokat a lehetőségek, amelyek megvannak, és még tele van abszurditásokkal, bírságokkal, nyelvrendőrséggel, minden olyan dologgal, ami a minden egyes ember életét befolyásolni fogja, és az országban a feszültséget növelni. Nagykövet úr, Volker nagykövet úr is a békéről beszélt, a béke megteremtésének a lehetőségeiről. Én is ezt tartom Ukrajna jövője számára a legfontosabbnak, hogy Kelet-Ukrajnában teremtődjön béke. És azt hiszem, hogy itten Zelenszky úr megválasztásával az ország lakossága döntő többsége szintén a béke mellett tette le a voksot. És nagyon érdekes az, hogy ugye nincs meg ez a földrajzi különbség, hanem az országnak a 90%-a ugyanazt akarja, ami kivehető abból, amit Zelenszky úr ezzel kapcsolatban mondott. Reméljük azt, hogy ez felgyorsíthatja a békefolyamatot. Valóban először a tűzszünettel kell kezdeni ezt a dolgot, illetve jó lenne az, hogy a térségbe békefenntartók érkeznének, akik itten a kedélyeket megnyugtatnák, hiszen közös erőfeszítéseket tennünk annak érdekében, hogy több ember ne halljon meg már ott a fronton, és ez a humanitárius katasztrófa, amit nagykövet úr is említett ebben a térségben, az szűnjön meg. Azonban kisebbségiként is, meg ukrajnai politikusként is el szeretném mondani, a másik fontos kérdés, amire szintén van remény, Zelenszky úr megválasztásával, de lehet, hogy ez az egész dolog csak majd a parlamenti választások után realizálódhat, az az ukrán identitáspolitikának a megváltozása. Ukrajnának nem etnikai nemzetet kellene építeni, hanem politikai nemzetet, egy olyan európai demokratikus országot kellene építenie, ahol tiszteletben tartják az emberi jogokat, és az emberi jogoknak pedig része a nemzeti jogok, a nyelvhez, az oktatáshoz való jog, az emberi jogoknak a része, és azt hiszem, hogy ezt támogatta az ország lakosságnak a döntő többsége. Köszönöm szépen a figyelmet!
Köszönjük szépen. The question is, of course, also what hope we can have for peace in a moment when Russia has just offered citizenship for the population in Luhansk, in the Donetsk and Luhansk region. This is not something that depends on Ukraine, and we cannot hold Ukraine hostage for something that he cannot or it cannot solve. Kalman.
Thank you very much, Noemi, and thank you for inviting me to this very illustrious event with fantastic speakers and also a fantastic audience, looking at friends, very, very highly qualified experts and diplomats. So, excellencies and dear friends, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. And only time prevents me from a long personal introductory note about some of the panel participants. Zsolt, 30 years of friendship, and Laszlo Brenzovic, whom you have heard, an extraordinary source of wisdom about really understanding Ukraine. And this is where I would like to start, where I made a mistake going to the in my predictions going to the election, and that gives me an opportunity to really analyze what has happened. And the reason for spending time on this is that it has a lot of significance for the future. I really thought that Poroshenko is going to try, or was going to try, to repeat the 1999 election of Kuchma, when he was already, as a young man, in a very good position to observe it, and then in 2004, he was in a key position to help to orchestrate the Orange Revolution. So Poroshenko is a man of extraordinary experience, and I thought, and I think I was right thinking, that he would try to reorchestrate 99 by bringing in the second round somebody against whom it will be easy to win. And I thought, and I think I was right, that he really wanted to avoid Tymoshenko. He succeeded. Now, on April 1, I must confess, I thought that he really will, not easily, but he will get it. Zelensky is totally inexperienced. He didn't campaign personally, he campaigned only, he conducted a virtual campaign, and he didn't say anything, and he hasn't said anything until the election about his purpose to govern and his program. I was right, but it was not enough. And Laszlo is right that I also should have looked more carefully about the negative ratings of Poroshenko. So then the question is where the negatives come from, and it is important. One, that he has done reforms, so Kurt is right, and by the way, I should say that Kurt Volker enjoys an extraordinary popularity, not only in Hungary, which is totally understandable emotionally, but also in the whole region, including Ukraine, because of his very clear-minded analysis, his deep understanding of Russia and the Russian actions, deep understanding of Ukraine, as well as the whole nature of this post-communist transition. So, but by this I forgot to say about referring to him. So, he's right that under Poroshenko many reforms have happened. But I also should say, being an independent speaker here, that that Poroshenko failed critical reforms. And some of these critical reforms would have been popular. People usually refer to fight against corruption. I do prefer to take a broader look and think about establishing the rule of law. It's a formidable and complex task, but thinking about the rule of law actually avoids some of the pitfalls of looking at corruption as simply an issue of fight. Although I have to say that it would have been very popular in Ukraine if he puts in jail, or acknowledging the practical non-independence of the judiciary, puts in jail some of the perpetrators in the 2013 revolution, against the revolutionaries, as well as the blatant stealing by Yanukovych and his cronies in the period leading up to the revolution. So he has lost a lot of goodwill by not doing that. But also, during the Poroshenko period, the judicial reforms have not happened sufficiently, and prosecution, which is really an extraordinarily important part of the fabric of what Henry Hale calls patronal politics, has really been kept largely intact, as well as the state security services. So a very large area of issues that could have defined positively this presidential period, and was largely in the power of the president, not entirely, but largely, have been missed. So that is one very important reason why Poroshenko has not been popular. And the other has been mentioned also by Laszlo and also by Kurt. It has turned out, and this is really very important to understand, it has turned out that the Ukrainian society is extremely mature when it comes to national identity. They do opt, by and large, for the civic identity rather than narrowly defined ethno-linguistic identity. And this is really critical, and Poroshenko's advisors have done, demonstrably, a mistake of misjudging this situation. So that is really extremely important. There are a few other issues. It has been measured how negative news about Poroshenko and Zelensky have been distributed in television. Well, it has been 80-20. In other words, subtly, the major oligarchs, Kolomoisky, Pinchuk, Firtash, Akhmetov, who control the television space, have really opted for the inexperienced president rather than the one who himself is an oligarch and has strived in this period, which was also a mistake in my view, to become one of the top oligarchs. So here there has been a conflict with the oligarchs, and very subtly they have opted for the, and of course more than 70% of Ukrainians still take their view about the world from television. So the approach of these four oligarchs has been critical to shape the. Laszlo has spoken about administrative resources, and I am taking his wisdom here to say that besides television, it's also a fact that the Minister of Internal Affairs has not been from Poroshenko's camp. So, in fact, Poroshenko has had very limited administrative resources in this to go into this fight. Now, on Zelensky's side, it's a retrospective thing. I didn't believe it will happen, but it has happened, that his TV series, The Servant of People, offers a beautiful fairy tale about a president who is by chance becoming a president, who is inexperienced, but he, instead of wanting to serve the oligarchs, wants to serve the people. Of course, it's easy to realize it on a television series. It's going to be extremely difficult to realize it in real life because the Ukrainian political system is based on this, on the oligarchic power. One of the big human rights fighters in Ukraine said yesterday that who Zelensky is will be shown by his appointments of the chef de cabinet, prosecutor general, minister of defense, head of the security services, and minister of foreign affairs. Granted, they have to be accepted by the parliament, but still, his intentions will be really revealed in this, and whether he wants to confront the oligarchs who are also controlling a majority in the parliament. Of course, the oligarchs themselves are not a homogeneous set, but still he will have to take some fights in order to get his way. Now, speaking of the major challenges, the war, and we have seen already in the last couple of days that Vladimir Putin is not sitting idle in this situation. He's trying to create a fait accompli for Zelensky, showing also what both Kurt and Laszlo have indicated, that Zelensky is not Putin's choice. In fact, the only television channels that have been friendly to Poroshenko, besides his not very popular, by now not very popular Channel 5, have been the ones that are controlled by Mr. Medvedchuk, whose daughter's what is it? Goddaughter is the godfather is Mr. Putin. So it shows a little bit of a Byzantine complexity to Ukrainian politics that is not easy from outside to understand. But the war is going to be a major challenge. So Putin has introduced a decree by which in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics, people can, in an easy way, to get Russian citizenship, and I would be extremely delighted if the high official in our circle could say a little bit about what reaction the international community can possibly take, because it is a very, very serious hostile act towards Ukraine. And the other thing is that I heard from my friend János Székely this morning, it has been in the news that Yanukovych's lawyer says that Yanukovych will go home, which is again obviously a direct challenge by Putin towards the new president. Yanukovych will be put in jail in Ukraine because he is charged with national treason. So the managing the Russia relationship is extremely difficult. It needs very, very high level of competence. I have to say that Poroshenko has been, and Kurt may agree with me or not, but has been very talented and very skillful in managing the relationship with the international community to keep together a front that helped Ukraine in its challenge with Russia. And I really appreciate your point that this is an ongoing interstate conflict that is going on. Ukrainian soldiers die every day in the ongoing skirmishes. So another very big issue, of course, is going to be that Ukraine needs to continue to strengthen its army. Much has been done in the last 5 years, but more could be done. The army reform, there is a lot of room for improvement in that respect, and of course, I am very firmly advocating strong NATO, and easy for me to say so, but United States support to strengthening the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. But I have been also in the position to see how much more the Ukrainian government could do to facilitate this relationship with NATO. If I'm saying to you that the NATO experts couldn't enter the Ministry of Defense premises until quite recently, a couple of years ago, it shows a little bit of how much the inherited rigidities of Ukraine are still an obstacle. Western help and civil society is going to be critical in this period. Civil society was fantastic after the revolution, both in terms of, the front line would be very different if not this fantastic volunteer help, because there was very little army to speak of in early 2014, and it was really volunteers without equipment who saved Ukraine until at least the fall of 2014. But also, in the reanimation package of reforms, there was a fantastic unified civil society think tank force to demand and help the reforms. And I have to say that President Poroshenko has been listening to and has been in dialogue with this force, more in 2014 to 16 than later, but it was a very, very big part of the fabric. So these two factors, Western assistance and And civil society needs to be very important. And here the critical thing again is what I have already said, that we all have to be very smart about the way, without traditions, to help to get the rule of law, independent and fair judiciary in place, for which again the slogan of fighting corruption is a somewhat misleading slogan, which I'm not saying that you don't have to fight corruption. In Georgia, and after the Rose Revolution, it has gone sort of hand in hand, but still it triggers much better ideas if you think about the bigger picture here than if you do just this trying to put in jail perpetrators. The public needs blood, and sometimes we, also in Brussels, are to be faulted by concentrating on the blood and not on institutional strength of the judiciary and the fairness, the uncorruptedness of the prosecutorial stuff, which of course is Comrade Wyszynski has been a fantastically important part of the Soviet fabric, and what has it evolved into since then. I'm not a Hungarian official, and I only would like to say one thing to this language issue in context with Hungary, that I think Hungary will have now a golden opportunity, largely echoing what Kurt has already said, a golden opportunity to open a new chapter in its relationship with Ukraine, and I just hope that it will be a constructive relationship. I fully agree that the jeopardizing the NATO relationship is not this linkage between that and the language issue should be finished, and I just hope that it will give this election result will give a golden opportunity to the Hungarian leadership to do so. So thank you very much again for the invitation, and here I finish my intervention.
Okay, I don't think we need a better prompt than this for Zsolt. Is there an opportunity for change in the bilateral relations?
Köszönöm szépen, hölgyeim és uraim, nagy tisztelettel köszöntöm Önöket. If you don't mind, I would opt for the Hungarian possibility to speak. Nagyon örülök annak, hogy a Danube Institute megrendezte ezt a kis mini konferenciát. Ma nincs könnyű helyzetben az, aki a think tank közösségnek a követője, hiszen délután is egy nagyon rangos konferenciát szervezett a külügyi intézet, részben ugyanezekkel az előadókkal, akik most is felszólalnak. De azt hiszem, hogy fontos látnunk azt, hogy ez a think tank közösség a Atlanti óceánon immáron átnyúlóan egyre elmélyültebb dialógusban van. Legyen az az Atlanti Tanács, a McCain Institute, a Danube Institute, a Külügyi Intézet. Én magam is egyébként John O'Sullivannel a Heritage Alapítványban ismerkedtem meg, amikor egy rendezvényen ő elnökölt, és volt alkalmam ott felszólalni. És Noémi, neked is szeretnék gratulálni, hogy ezt a rendezvényt nagyon aktuálisan sikerült tető alá hozni. Előre szeretnék bocsájtani 3 dolgot, és utána szeretnék mondani még 4 darab dolgot. Tehát előre azt szeretném bocsájtani, hogy nagyon fontosnak tartjuk azt a sikert, amit Zelenszky úr elért. Orbán Viktor fontosnak tartotta, hogy kinyilvánítsa az ezzel kapcsolatos egyértelmű örömét, nyitottságát a tárgyalásokra, az a fajta golden opportunity, amiről itt Mizsei Kálmán beszélt, az szemmel láthatóan ebből a levélből kiolvasható. De azt gondolom, hogy nem csak Magyarország számára egy golden opportunity, hogy megegyezzen Ukrajnával, hanem Ukrajna számára is egy golden opportunity, hogy megegyezzen Magyarországgal. Tehát bízom benne, hogy ezt a golden opportunity-t Ukrajna nem fogja elszalasztani. A mai hír a nyelvtörvény elfogadásáról az sajnálatos módon nem ebbe az irányba mutat, hiszen egy ilyen jelentős többséggel elfogadott törvényi szabályozás nem fogja egyszerűsíteni ennek a golden opportunity-nek a kiaknázását. Itt bízunk a ukrán vezetésnek, a régi új vezetésnek a kollektív bölcsességében. Természetesen az irigység és a bátorítás is az eredményekben benne rejlik, hiszen mi itt Magyarországon ugyan hozzászoktunk a kétharmados győzelemhez, elnézést, ha itt a pártpolitikus szólal meg bennem, de ez a 4/5 vagy 3/4 győzelem, ez mindenféleképpen imponáló. Részben az irítséget, részben pedig a további növekedésnek a potenciálját jelzi a számunkra. Azt gondolom, hogy itt a viccet félretéve azért azon érdemes elgondolkodnunk, Amerikában is érdemes elgondolkodni, Nyugat-Európában is érdemes elgondolkodni, hogy mi a magyarázata annak, hogy Poroshenko úr 23%-ot tudott elérni, amellett a politika mellett, amit itt az elmúlt években az egész nyugati közösség fölmutatott. Itt Merkel kancellárnak a legutolsó gesztusára hadd utaljak, amikor ugye fontosnak tartotta Poroshenkót fogadni. És azért ez a 23%, ez lehet, hogy még nem is volt 23%, ahogy itt hallhattuk az adminisztratív potenciállal kapcsolatban Brenzovics Lászlónak a megállapításait. Tehát lehet, hogy ez az adat is egy kicsit még félrevezető. Lehet, hogy nem is csak 3/4 volt ez a győzelem. Tehát ez lenne az első előre bocsájtott megjegyzésem. Az ukrajnai helyzettel kapcsolatban a gratuláció az újonnan megválasztott elnöknek, a landslide victory, az egészen egyedülálló győzelemhez. Második megjegyzésem az lenne, hogy Magyarország 1991 óta Jeszenszky Géza külügyminiszter úrnak a tevékenysége óta folyamatosan és elkötelezetten megérti az ukrán államiságnak a sajátos helyzetét, elkötelezett Ukrajna szuverenitása és területi integritása mellett, és támogatólag viszonyul ahhoz a nemzetépítési folyamathoz, ami Ukrajnában zajlik. Azt gondolom, hogy kevés ország nyilvánította ki ennyire egyértelműen a támogató magatartását Ukrajna mellett. És itt most nem akarok elmerülni ennek a részleteibe, nagyon sok mindent tudnánk összegszerűen is megemlíteni, és mind a mai napig tartóan is demonstratívan aláhúzni. Hadd utaljak csak mondjuk azért mégis egy dologra az, hogy Magyarország folyamatosan Ukrajnának a reverse gázszállításon keresztül, együttműködve a lengyelekkel és a szlovákokkal, nyugatról biztosítja a gázellátását, ugyanis 5 éve Ukrajna nem vásárol gázt Oroszországtól, hanem kizárólag nyugati irányból van Ukrajna gázzal ellátva, és ebben talán a ma is folyó molekulának a szempontját az érdemes figyelembe venni, amikor arról beszélünk, hogy milyen szolidaritást nyilvánít ki Magyarország. Ez a szolidaritás ez megvolt, megvan és fönnáll a viták ellenére is Ukrajna irányába, és nincsen semmi okunk arra nézve, hogy ezen változtassunk. A harmadik előre bocsájtandó megjegyzésem pedig az lenne, hogy Magyarországnak valóban 97. szeptemberét követően kialakult egy nagyon éles vitája Ukrajnával, amely az ukrán oktatási törvény, és most már azt gondolom, hogy a mai naptól bátran oda rakhatjuk a listára a nyelvtörvényt is, azzal, hogy egy teljesen más politikai kontextusban került ennek a nyelvtörvénynek az elfogadására sor. Tehát ilyen értelemben ennek a helyi értékén való kezelése az nyilvánvalóan fontos a mi részünkről, erre azért mindjárt vissza fogok majd térni. De mi, amikor hangot adtunk ezeknek a nézetkülönbségeinknek, akkor azt is fontosnak tartottuk hangsúlyozni, és most is így gondolom, hogy ezek a viták, ezek kisebb részben kétoldalúak. Ezek alapvetően az emberi jogokról szólnak, és arról szólnak, hogy milyen minősége lesz az ukrán demokráciának. Márpedig a NATO számára, amely egy értékközösséget jelent, az emberi jogok és a jogállamiságnak a kérdése, az nem minősülhet bilaterális kérdésnek, hanem a legfontosabb fundamentumát képezi a NATO és egy potenciális partner együttműködésének. Tehát ez a 3 megjegyzésem lenne, amit előre bocsátani fontosnak gondolok, és ami pedig az aktuális helyzetről, ugye What's Next for Ukraine a rendezvényünknek a címe, vagy Što dělať, hogy most ezt a nyelvi sokszínűséget is behozzam. Tehát először is úgy vélem, hogy szükség van egy politikai konszolidációra. Úgy látszik, hogy minden jel szerint nagyon komoly erők mozdultak meg a helyzet destabilizációja érdekében. A további destabilizáció érdekében, mert idáig sem voltak olyan állatira stabilak és konszolidáltak Ukrajnában a viszonyok, de szemmel láthatóan egy új minősége van a politikai destabilizációnak. Ennek természetesen Moszkva irányából van számos már kézzelfogható lépése, de most a Verhovna Ráda irányából is egy nagyon drasztikus destabilizációs intézkedésre került sor a mai napon a nyelvtörvénynek az elfogadásával. És ennek a destabilizációnak az elkövetkezendő időszakban számtalan etapja, fejezete lehetséges, amelyre föl kell készülnünk. És itt egy kulcsfontosságú kérdés az, hogy lesz-e a nép szolgálja pártból effektív politikai erő. Jelenleg az a 35%-os népszerűség egy nem létező párt esetében, amit itt Brenzovics László megfogalmazott, az egy kiváló lehetőség ennek a célkitűzésnek a megvalósítása érdekében, de mindenféleképpen ide lehet hozni azt a kérdést, hogy miként lesznek Ukrajnában parlamenti választások, mikor lesznek Ukrajnában parlamenti választások, hogyan fog a jelenlegi politikai helyzetből eljutni egy relatív stabilitásig az ukrán politika. És azt gondolom, hogy ez nem lesz a művész úr számára egy könnyű időszak, Zelenszky úr számára egy könnyű időszak, hogy politikailag ezt a jelenlegi helyzetet valamennyire kézbe tudja venni, még akkor sem, hogyha nem fosztják meg a jogköreitől. Ugye hallhattuk a második destabilizációs szándék a Verhovna Rádában, hogy megfosztják az elnöki jogköreitől, alkotmány ide, alkotmány oda. Még ha nem fosztják meg, az a meglehetősen erősnek minősülő jogkör, amivel rendelkezik, az mennyiben fog számára elegendő eszköztárat biztosítani ahhoz, hogy konszolidálja politikai értelemben. Tehát nem politikai konszolidáció a What's Next kérdésnek a kiinduló pontja. A második kérdés, amit én ide hoznék közvetlenül, ezt úgy nevezném el, hogy kulturális konszolidáció. És itt már valóban nagyon fontos, hogy ránézzünk a térképre, megértsük, hogy milyen választások után vagyunk, és értékeljük, hogy mivel magyarázható ez a 23% kontra 75%-os eredmény. Ezt tegyük föl magunknak is, ezt a kérdést nyugaton, hogy mivel magyarázzuk, hogy ez történt Ukrajnában. Kevés választ hallottam erről, hogy mi ennek a magyarázata. És én nagyon egyszerűen azt tudnám mondani, hogy a militarizmus, amely sajnálatos módon az orosz agresszióval belépett az ukrán politikába, az sajnálatos módon a kultúra területén is megjelent. És egy kulturális militarizmusnak lett az áldozata az elmúlt időszakban Ukrajna. Egy agresszív kisebbség, lembergi agresszív kisebbség képes volt egy olyan kulturális modellt ráerőltetni, ráerőszakolni Ukrajnára, amelyre azt tudom mondani, hogy egy intoleráns identitás politikának a megnyilvánulása, a megjelenítése volt. Az identitáspolitika, ahogy Kurt Volker elmondta, fontos. És a mi empátiánk, a nemzetépítés, a nation building irányában nyilvánvalóan nagyon fontos. De amikor az identitáspolitika intoleráns identitáspolitikává válik, amikor meghirdeti a hadsereg az egy nyelv, az egy hit agresszív, intoleráns identitáspolitikáját az ukrán vezetés, akkor talán egy kicsit értünk valamit abból, hogy mi történt, hogy miből lett elege az ukrán társadalomnak, hogy mitől következett be egy több mint 3/4-es földcsúszamlásszerű győzelem. Én azt gondolom, hogy jó helyen keresgéljük a magyarázatot, hogyha azt mondjuk, hogy ez az intoleráns identitáspolitika, ez helyet kell adjon egy toleráns, plurális identitáspolitikának. Ez az alapvető kérdés, hogy ezt a hidat, ezt a kulturális konszolidációt is végre tudja hajtani az új elnök, amelynek nyilvánvalóan az előbb említett területek kulcsfontosságú vonatkozásai. Legyen szó oktatásról, legyen szó nyelvi jogok kérdéséről, vagy legyen szó az egyház és a vallás kérdésköréről. Ezek az elmúlt időszakban kiemelkedő helyet töltöttek be. A harmadik dimenzió az nyilvánvalóan az egy kicsit egyszerűbb, de hát az előbbiek alapján azért annyira nem lesz egyszerű, ez a diplomáciai konszolidáció. Ugye, és itt nem elsősorban Oroszországra vonatkozik ez a konszolidációs szükség, hanem a nyugati szomszédokkal. És itt nem csak Magyarországról van szó. Hadd hangsúlyozzam, hogy ez a fajta identitáspolitikai és emlékezetpolitikai vita sokkal virulensebb formában jelenik meg Lengyelország viszonylatában, márpedig Lengyelországnak a támogatása Ukrajna irányába az elmúlt 30 esztendőben azt gondolom, hogy vetekszik azzal, ahogy Magyarország viszonyult és viszonyul Lengyelországhoz. Itt az elmúlt időszakban láthattuk a Bandera kultusszal kapcsolatosan kibontakozó konfliktusokat az emlékezetpolitika dimenziójában, vagy éppen ugyancsak az oktatáspolitikában megjelenő konfliktusokat, amikor Lembergben a lengyel iskolákat gyakorlatilag a közelmúltban betiltották, mint lengyel iskoláknak a működését. És Romániát ugyanide sorolhatnánk, és Bulgáriát ugyancsak ide sorolhatnánk. Érdemes megnézni azt, hogy milyen eredményt ért el Poroshenko úr ezekben a körzetekben. A bolgárok által lakott területeken 3%-ot tudott Poroshenko úr elérni. Azt gondolom, hogy ez is megér egy komolyabb elemzést, hiszen ennek is a diplomáciai továbblépés szempontjából kulcsfontosságú szerepe van. Magyarország készen áll arra, hogyha Ukrajna is készen áll arra, hogy megtaláljuk a megfelelő megoldást. De Magyarország nincs abban a helyzetben, hogy egyoldalú engedményeket tegyen, mert láthatjuk, hogy a nyelvi kérdés az nem egy parciális kérdés, hanem egy centrális kérdése annak a fajta kulturális, háborús közhangulatnak, amelyben jelenleg Ukrajna van. A nyelvi kérdés az nem másodlagos, hanem elsődleges. A speciális státusz, amelyet a Minszki Egyezmény körvonalaz, az mindenek előtt a nyelvi kérdésről szól. És csak ezt követően szól számos egyéb vonatkozásról. Nyilvánvalóan a decentralizációnak, a szintjének a megvalósítása az elkövetkezendő években egy kulcsfontosságú reformterülete lesz Ukrajnának, de a speciális státusz az nem létezik speciális nyelvi rezsim megteremtése nélkül, amely egyébként idáig, a mai napig a régi nyelvtörvény alapján működhetett volna, hiszen a régi nyelvtörvény lehetővé tette a regionális hivatalos nyelveknek a megvalósítását. Mától tudtommal, nem tudom, hogy mit tartalmaz az éjszakai módosítás, tudtommal a regionális hivatalos nyelvnek a lehetősége megszűnt jogi értelemben Ukrajnában, ami nem teszi könnyűvé a minszki megállapodásoknak adott esetben sem a végrehajtását, de az már nem ebbe a diplomáciai konszolidációs kérdéskörbe tartozik, mert az a negyedik. A negyedik az nyilvánvalóan pedig a geopolitikai konszolidáció, a béke folyamatnak az elindítása. És az igazi golden opportunity az most erre van. És azt gondolom, hogy ha ezt a golden opportunity-t meg tudja ragadni Zelenszky elnök úr, akkor van egy esélye arra, hogy rendezni tudja azt a nagyon bonyolult helyzetet, amiben jelenleg Ukrajna van. Egyetértek John O'Sullivannel, hogy egy művésznek, egy színésznek a messze menő képességeire lesz szüksége az elnök úrnak ahhoz, ami Ronald Reaganhez hasonlítható, hogyha ezt a számtalan problémát, amelyet én ebben a 4 konszolidációs vonatkozásban próbáltam összesűríteni, meg akarja valósítani. Köszönöm szépen a figyelmüket.
Thank you, Zsolt. So we have heard in what respect Ukraine should change its policies, but what should the West change? Because despite all of these problems, President Poroshenko has had some achievements. He has contained the war, he has signed the association agreement and the free trade agreement with Europe, he achieved the visa-free travel, he has had some reforms. He has had the support of the West, and despite of this, he has been swept away. So apart from the problems Zsolt has mentioned, what are the reasons, and what can we change, or what shall the West change?
Thank you very much, Naomi. I think you set out some important...
And
Yes.
just one more question. I would appreciate if you mentioned Nord Stream 2, because Germany has been touched upon by one of the speakers. So I think that's also a crucial issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naomi. Let me just first say thank you to the Danube Institute for having you. So John O'Sullivan and Naomi so graciously hosted the Atlantic Council when Denise and I were last here. We're delighted to be back with Ambassador Volker on this trip, and thank you for your promotion of realistic Atlanticism here in the region. And we're delighted that Ambassador Kornstein has been with us, who so ably represents the United States here in Hungary, and to be joined by the Ukrainian ambassador. Welcome. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with extraordinary colleagues who have done so much to represent Hungary's voice internationally, to promote Hungarian-Ukrainian relations, and importantly for us, to promote Hungarian-American relations. And thank you, Laszlo and Kalman and Zsolt, for being such strong friends of the United States. It's really why we're here. In many respects, we're here because we're marking many of the anniversaries that are taking place of quite significance this year. But we're not just thinking about the past. We're here because we want to make an investment in the future of what is the agenda, the spine of the U.S.-Hungarian alliance going forward. And so I think it's quite appropriate that we're talking about Ukraine, because this is where we have such strong shared interests. But as we think about that context, I'll talk a little bit about the context, the moment and what's next, as Naomi outlined these questions. As we think about where we were 30 years ago, the front line of freedom really was through this region, through here in Hungary. We watched as Hungarians sheltered East Germans, providing the critical push that began to tear down the Iron Curtain. We watched as Hungarians began to call for the push of Russian forces out of this region. And I think if we flash forward to today, 30 years later, that front line of freedom is now just to your east, in your neighbor, in Ukraine. And as Kurt, Ambassador Volker, started with, this front line of freedom is where we actually see an active conflict with a Russian invasion that's meant to undermine the very concept of national identity, sovereignty, and the promise of Europe. And so what we're talking about here, I think, is much bigger than the issue of Ukraine, Hungarian-Ukrainian elections. It is in the context of how we in the United States increasingly see the challenge that we face, that countries like Hungary and the United States, which are the spine of a free world, are really being challenged by an authoritarian state-led capitalist model of a malevolent kind we've seen from the Kremlin, and that's playing out in Ukraine today. So if we think back over this 30 years, in many respects for Hungarians relating to the issues today, through that 30 years, Hungary came home. And that manifested itself 20 years ago in joining NATO, later in the European Union, came home to a common family. And we'll talk a little bit about that later today as well. And that was really built on identity, as Kurt mentioned in his opening. But in Ukraine, over those past 30 years, in many respects, its independence arrived a bit unexpected. There was a degree of ambivalence that meant that some of those 3 decades has not been used to the maximum like we've seen here. But I think now, in many respects, thanks to Vladimir Putin, thanks to a revanchist Kremlin that has worked to roll back those post-Cold War gains, and thanks mostly to the Ukrainian people themselves, we see a Ukraine that has a chance much like Hungary had to reclaim its role 30 years ago. And Hungarians succeeded because Hungarians demanded and determined the course that they would take. But Naomi's asked us about the response of the West, and the United States then had a bit of a responsibility to respond. And through President George Herbert Walker Bush setting out a vision of a Europe whole and free, we began to respond by setting out a strategy that was built on an idea that we would pursue a different type of partnership with Russia that would unlock the pathway of former adversaries becoming allies, opening the pathway to NATO enlargement, and to provide an umbrella that could really lead to a deepening of Europe and its prosperity. And this fueled the enlargement process that Kurt began to talk about in his remarks that played out so successfully for 100 million people through this broader region, and still plays out today as we've seen welcoming Montenegro, and now we're on the cusp of welcoming North Macedonia. But Vladimir Putin said no to this bargain in 2008 in Europe's east, particularly in Ukraine. When not far from here at a Bucharest summit, Vladimir Putin came and told Western leaders that questioned whether Ukraine was a country, challenged its identity, its sovereignty, really foreshadowed Russian policy today. And unfortunately, a summit where for the first time the United States and Germany really split on what to do about something big, uncertainty over Ukraine and Georgia's future. And so flash forward to the moment we have now. So Naomi, you're right. We've just seen a term of President Poroshenko come to an end, and arguably a term of a Ukrainian president that has done more than any other to advance reforms in Ukraine, to consolidate the nation, to strengthen the army, to bolster its relationship with the West. He did an awful lot of good for the Ukrainian people and for those of us invested in our relationship with Ukraine. But in many respects, we heard a resounding cry from the Ukrainian electorate that that wasn't enough. And I think that's a pretty interesting thing. I think that's a pretty good thing. And so we're coming through an election that first just underscores that democracy is alive and well to Hungary's east, and that is just something that we shouldn't take for granted, because that's certainly not the case in Russia today. And it really is in Ukraine. After all, where the most radical nationalist forces that people are concerned about scored under 2%. That the fascist regime the Kremlin talks about is a country now led by a president and prime minister of the Jewish faith. And I think significantly, which may have been lost a little bit in the conversation, a candidate from essentially Ukraine's east, who is a Russian speaker, who has viewed consistently and said so Russia as an aggressor, has set a very different tone from previous candidates from Ukraine's east. And while we don't know a lot, was someone who coalesced a sense of reformers around him. Many of the reformers who actually left Poroshenko's government coalesced around Zelensky. But there's a big wild card. We don't know who he is. We don't have there's a lot of ambiguity, although to be fair, many of our colleagues, the Atlantic Council, have had quite a few meetings with him over the course of this campaign and have been reassured by that. But that brings us to what do we do now? And I think this is just underscoring here in Budapest that we have a deeply shared strategic interest, and that our Europe, our free world, welcomes and includes Ukraine. And I think as you pointed out, in many respects, Hungary has been a champion of Ukraine's ability to determine its future as part of the strategic West. We're here to argue that in many respects, Washington and Budapest shouldn't just have a commonality for interest, but this should be a common strategy that the United States and Hungary are working on together to help ensure and support Ukraine's success, because that's actually what's best for our interests. Certainly as a neighbor of Ukraine, it's in Hungary's interest, and arguably for Hungarian speakers in Ukraine, a Ukraine that is prosperous, democratic, anchored in the West, is good for that community. And so we have a common agenda that we need to understand and work together on. We haven't been as coordinated in the offense of what we believe in and want to do as much as we have been in defense, in contrast to a Russia that very clearly understands its task is to restore Ukraine to its sphere of influence. And in many respects, I'm not sure that we appreciate the entire architecture of Europe's security and defense today rests on the outcome of what plays out in Ukraine. And so we have to be humble and recognize that what does come next, I think, will first and foremost be determined by President-elect Zelensky, by a Rada that will transform itself as it goes through elections. But I think even powerfully, as this election has showed us, by the Ukrainian people themselves. There is powerful agency in the people of Ukraine, the dynamism of its civil society, the engagement of its society, despite the frustrations with corruption, lack of change, not as much progress on reform. And it's consistently that agency of people in this region that the Kremlin has underestimated, which is why I think they keep getting it wrong. That it isn't a top-down controlled process. Hungarians wouldn't have had it. Today, Ukrainians won't have it. Certainly Georgia. It's not up to us to sit down and decide with the Kremlin what happens in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people won't have it. And that's, I think, what's a powerful driver here. But it also means there's not scope for a sense that we hear in our capital a lot or in Brussels, Ukraine fatigue. I mean, that's kind of hogwash. I think it's in our strategic interest to be invested in the success and to tackle this in a more concerted way. And so I know that one of the obstacles to a stronger, clearer Hungarian, American, Western strategy in support of Ukraine has been a very sensitive issue of language education. And I think it's important to understand that we've got to get that right in a way that doesn't give oxygen and legitimacy to Mr. Putin's arguments as he tries to manipulate Ukraine's future. The Russians want a decentralization that empowers the puppet regimes in the East so that they can permanently disrupt bloc reforms in Ukraine and particularly its Western integration. We can't empower and legitimize Russian thugs as power brokers in Ukraine's future. So it does mean we need to seize on, I think, President Zelensky's message that issues of language and culture need to be advanced through incentives. I think that's a good framework to think about it. It does speak to a little bit of perhaps a delay on the immediacy of the issue, to understand we need to get through a parliamentary errata election in which tough decisions probably can't be taken in the interim or probably shouldn't even be forced in the interim. But to lean in on the idea of how to understand that Ukrainians are fighting for a sense of an identity, a future based in a consolidated nation, which Vladimir Putin has tried to extinguish and deny that there is Ukrainian identity. And he said it in 2008 in front of our leaders at a NATO summit. And so we need to understand that motivation. And I'll close just by saying it gives us a lot to think about on what we can do together with Ukraine, on the security front, on how to build a Ukrainian army, and yes, Navy in particular, on how to bolster Ukraine's relationship with NATO so that it's as deep as it can be, like Georgia's, and to remove and not block the meetings, but I think even more importantly, the practical cooperation. How we focus right now on Black Sea access, the Sea of Azov, and understanding that what's unfolding on the water is another form of creeping occupation. That we recognize the passportization that's been announced for folks living in Donetsk and Luhansk. We have seen this playbook before in Abkhazia, Tskhinvali. We know where this leads. But we also know that the most difficult things, much like Hungary's Achilles heel has been energy, how we work strategically together in ensuring and mitigating dependency on Russian sources of energy for the entire region through, particularly in Ukraine, stepped up efficiency, domestic production, alternative routes, and fundamentally to help show that by being part of the free world, we don't just talk about what it means for liberty, but it's unleashing the power of individuals to be entrepreneurs, to be innovative, to compete, and to give Ukrainians a sense of the prosperity that our system should be able to offer, and to build that kind of common agenda. It's here, I think, where often conflated in Washington and conflated in our debate with Hungary, if we understand with clarity the strategy that the Kremlin is playing out in Ukraine and this region to undermine Ukraine, restore their sense of sphere of influence, to divide our alliance, that we need to figure out how to work together as a community, as a family, so that we aren't exposed to arguments of hypocrisy when it comes to Nord Stream, for example. And the Russians don't cynically see that they can play us off, deal with us one by one, leverage a little bit here and there, that we require a more concerted and common front to take on those issues and to speak with clarity why our concerns on Nord Stream are as valid as concerns on Russians arming forces in Ukraine's east.
Thank you, Damon, for this dynamic and somewhat optimistic closing of the round. As always, we are running out of time, but I'd like to give the opportunity to the panelists to react to, if they want to each other's comments in a limited time frame, and then we'll give the floor to the ambassador of Ukraine.
Köszönöm szépen. Néhány gondolat ezzel kapcsolatban. Sajnálatos módon Poroshenko úgy állította be az elnökválasztásnak a második fordulóját, hogy vagy Poroshenko, vagy Putyin. Hát ha az eredményt nézzük, akkor... De ez nem így van. Nem így van, és nem is szabad így beállítani a kérdést. Az emberek nem így gondolták a választásokon. Számomra is örömteljes az, hogy mégiscsak Ukrajnában vannak választások, bár én az ukrán rendszert versengő oligarchiának nevezném inkább. Tehát Oroszországban nem versenyző oligarchia van, Ukrajnában versengő oligarchia, amikor az oligarchikus erőcsoportosulások, azok mégiscsak választások útján döntik el azt, hogy kinek mekkora befolyása. Nagyon fontosnak tartom, hogy az a szembenállás, amivel Poroshenko a második fordulóban próbálkozott, azt el kellene felejteni. Nagyon fontos lenne Ukrajna jövője szempontjából, Ukrajna nyugati jövője szempontjából az, hogyha a geopolitikai választást és az identitai választást külön választanánk. Nem jelenti azt, hogyha valaki meg akarja őrizni a nyelvét, kultúrát, oktatási rendszerét, hogy orosz párti. Ez nincs így. És a választások eredmény is azt hiszem, hogy ezt jelenti. És nem jelenti azt, hogyha valaki ugye ukrán etnicista politikát kíván folytatni, az okvetlenül az emberi jogoknak és a nyugati értékeknek a bajnoka. Azt hiszem, hogyha ezt a szembeállítást megszüntetnénk, akkor nagyon fontos lépést tennénk az ukrajnai stabilitás irányába, és abba az irányba, hogy erősödjön a nyugat iránti elkötelezettség az ukrán társadalomba. Hiszen ennek nem csak az elitbe kell az elkötelezés megjelennie, hanem bele kell gyökereződnie a társadalomba. Gondoljuk bele abba, hogy Kelet-Ukrajna lakosságának az 50%-a nem volt soha a saját járásán kívül. Nem látta a világot, nem utazott sehová. Ami számára részben az van, amit a televízió közvetít, részben pedig az, amit a saját környezetében tapasztal. És hogyha ő a saját környezetében, egy olyan környezetben él, ahol mondjuk bolgárok élnek, vagy görögök élnek, vagy éppen oroszok élnek, és látja azt, hogy a nyelvi jogokat erőszakosan próbálják felszámolni, akkor ez köti össze a nyugatnak a befolyásával, nem pedig azt, ami valóban a NATO-nak és az Európának az értékei, amely elsősorban az emberi jogoknak a tiszteletben tartásáról van. A másik pedig az rendkívül fontos lenne a szélsőségek elleni fellépés. Az, hogy a nyugati államok, ne csak Magyarország, meg Románia, meg Lengyelország, ő is határozottan lépjen fel, hogy olyasmit tapasztal, ami nem felel meg a nyugati értékeknek. Mégiscsak fölháborító az, hogy például Ukrajna Kelemen Hunor román parlamenti képviselőt nem engedi be az országba, és kitiltja évekre. Hát hogy van ez? Szövetséges állam parlamenti képviselője, volt miniszterelnök helyettes, és mindenfajta ok nélkül kitiltják az országból, vagy nem beszélve azt, hogy a kárpátaljai magyarság évek óta üldöztetésnek van kitéve. Felrobbantották a székházunkat, tüntetések voltak ellenünk, ahol bennünket késekre kívántok volna hányni. Most a KMKS Jótékonysági Alapítványban benne ül a titkosszolgálatnak az egész nyomozóosztálya, más bűncselekmény Kárpátalján nem is történik, csak az, hogy egy jótékonysági alapítvány segíteni próbál az embereken. Nyilvánvalóan rendbe kell tenni a szomszédokkal való kapcsolatot Ukrajnának. Valamikor 91-ben, amikor Ukrajna létrejött, akkor egy átgondolt alapszerződési rendszer alakult ki, ahol minden országgal alapszerződések köttettek, amely alapszerződésekben a különböző vitás kérdések rendezve voltak, vagy még rendezni kívánták. Ezt Ukrajna most nem veszi figyelembe. Se Magyarország, se Lengyelország, se Románia vonatkozásában, viszont nem jött helyette semmi. Valaminek jönnie kell helyette. Meg kell beszélni az országoknak a közös dolgait, és kompromisszumot kell kötni ezekben az ügyekben. Így lesz csak egy kiegyensúlyozott kapcsolat Ukrajna és a nyugati szomszédjai között. Köszönöm szépen.
Köszönöm.
Two very short comments. I think there is a very large coalescence of views here, particularly about the very important need of civic identity and how much it also relates to many other issues. I would like to reflect on, really not polemically, but to add to the picture on two issues. One is, Zsolt mentioned decentralization, and I assume it's not particularly, the Ukrainian context is not particularly well known to Hungarian audience because it hasn't been written in Hungary about decentralization. So I would like to add something in line with what has been said. 2015 August, I think it was really an important point in the history of decentralization. There is a process that is very interesting, in a way very Ukrainian, a kind of spontaneous decentralization of power from the center to localities in case localities unite into larger entities. In Eastern Europe, in many countries, including Ukraine, the problem is that municipalities are extremely fragmented. I mean, villages usually don't have a capacity to have all the professional attributes to make a municipality work. But there was no political consensus of how to unite these 10,000 municipalities. So there was a spontaneous incentive-based decentralization. If municipalities unite, then rights and fiscal rights and fiscal opportunities are delegated to them, and it is really a lively process, and much of fiscal decentralization has taken place. It's a second best option to a well-designed, centrally managed process, but it is quite a good process. The political disagreement around decentralization is the following. Indeed, as I think Damon has said, the Russians have been pushing for a decentralization that is not this, but decentralization to the oblast, to the counties, in the hope of making Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts sort of very loosely connected to the Ukrainian central power, which obviously is not acceptable. And also, in the Minsk process, they cherry-picked the decentralization clauses, and they have disregarded the ones that the Russians, should have implemented. Now, what happened in August 2015, that President Poroshenko wanted to implement a decentralization law, including some compromises, concessions to those two regions, and there was a very, very strong disagreement in the Rada, and that episode, to use a shorthand, finished out Samopomich, the most liberal-minded party, because Samopomich is basically Lviv-based, Galicia-based, very particular ethno-linguistic identity approaches, and the deputy speaker at that time, Oksana Siroid, was very strongly against this law. She was partially right, but partially wrong in my view. Certainly, decentralization, defined in the way that I have just said at the beginning, is something very important, but at the same time, it shouldn't lead to the fragmentation of the country. So instead of being strongly against the whole law, and it created a huge political standoff, including street protests and including fatal incident. Instead of that, if there was a positive engagement with the process, also including some compromises, because political compromises the Western partners did expect, but not to the extent that it undermines the integrity of the country, would have been, for me, a much more preferred outcome. What I want to say with this is that it's very delicate. It's important to decentralize for the own sake of the Ukrainian state. It cannot go at the expense of the integrity of the country. The right thing is to decentralize much to the municipalities and not to the counties, which in the east and southeast can really serve Russian disintegration interests. And the Western community also has to approach it with this sophisticated understanding rather than using just word decentralization, centralization. It's an issue of that complexity. And the second comment is shorter. It's about Ukrainian identity. I remember in my time working with the Ukrainian government, I have a very great friend, some of you may know, Roman Romanov, who is at the Renaissance Foundation and does really great work of bottom-up reforms, really fantastic work, path-breaking work. And he said, he is actually from the Crimea, a very strong Ukrainian patriot. And he said, you know, our Ukrainian identity, as opposed to Russian identity, should include good governance, civic identity, good governance. And that hasn't been, I mean, we have to be honest, it hasn't been accomplished in this last 5 years, and it has cost a lot to President Poroshenko, in my view.
Then I've promised the Ambassador Lyubov Nepop, to, you can maybe come to the podium.
Jó napot kívánok, köszönöm szépen mindenkinek, nagyon érdekes beszélgetés részei voltunk, és gondolom, hogy ez mindenki számára fontos, hogy ismerjük meg az helyzetet és értsük meg. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank everybody for participation in this event and for very interesting comments and remarks. I would like to say some sentences which were not covered during this conversation, but also to use this opportunity to comment on some ideas and on some thoughts expressed during this conversation. First, I would start, of course, with elections. I think that the most important thing that it was free, fair, and democratic. It was acknowledged inside of the country and outside of the country. President Poroshenko, even without having official results, but already after receiving a result of the polls, said that he acknowledges his defeat and proposed support and help to President-elected Mr. Zelensky. It was very positively evaluated by Ukrainian population as well, and I think that it is also worth to mention that first in our history, people went to administration of President to thank President for what he did during the 5 years for Ukraine. We never had such a precedent. And here I would like to say about reasons and results. You know that there are a lot of, I think that we will still need a lot of time to understand it, but I think that it was important what Mr. Brenzovich noted about the map. That almost everywhere it was support for Mr. Zelensky, and even in the Lviv region, he was defeated, but not with such result, which we can say that he has no support at all. But to understand it, I think that it's important to say a few very important things. That first, no pro-Russian candidate was in second round. Second, that no radical candidate was in second round. And I would like also to say that even in previous elections, presidential and parliamentarian, we had no radical forces. That is when we are accused of being radical, of having some chauvinist or any other attitude, I think it has no ground in Ukrainian situation. And about reasons, I think that it's important to understand what was done in the last 5 years. It is important what all our international partners also acknowledge, that we made more reforms than during the whole previous period. How do you think, how painful were these reforms? Can you imagine if a country after 1991 remains unreformed, and during 5 years we speed up this process so drastically, and all this happens in situation of war? It was very painful. And that is why when we say about corruption, and I also agree that it's necessary to see in wider context of judicial reform, we see that situation with courts should be addressed as well. And when you have so huge tasks, probably 5 years sometime is not enough, and even in situation when you have to fight against one of the biggest armies in the world. And that is why I think that now people also voted, they supported reform, that they would like, but they would like to speed up it. They would like to have faster result, and they are not happy with the result which achieved, and what kind of result made them unhappy. We can see from the point of view it was made evaluation what people are waiting from a new president. And if you saw it, you understand that it was, first, they would like to have less tariffs, change of price for gas, for electricity. Second, they would like to take off immunity from deputies in parliament, from president. And third, they would like to see the result of anti-corruption cases, of investigation of these cases. So I don't see here situations that people were not, that it was some aggressive cultural attitude with which people were not happy. I think that exactly the slogan of new elected president, that it will be the end of epoch of poverty, addressed the situation of what people are waiting for. So I think that it was a very important reason, and I would like also to say that about these three slogans, just to be understood in this regard. It is not about one language, it's about language, state language to be enhanced. And here I did like the sentence, Ukraine deserves to have the same like others. And I think that Ukrainians deserves to have the same status of Ukrainian state language like Hungary has for Hungarian language in Hungary. And when we speak about religion, it's not about one church. It's about Ukrainian church, which was suppressed by Russia for a long period of time and only now received possibility to regain its independence. And we think that it was very, very important step. But at the same time, it was said all the time that we support equality of all churches, of all religions, and the state is not interfering in this situation. About army. If you remember what was 5 years ago, nobody was waiting for Ukraine that we will be able to stop in some certain point Russian aggression, because in reality our army was destroyed. We not built, we created a new army during 5 years. And yes, of course, we can say that we are waiting more and more, and it can be better. But I think that it is just fair to understand from what we start and what result we achieved during the 5 years. And I think that it is enormous and huge result. But of course, if you look to the history, and could you say that a lot of people who really decided to make reforms, they were elected? I think that this question is still has to be answered later. About, of course, I would like to answer also to the question, and yes, it was adopted today, this language on state law. It's not about languages of minorities. It will be one more law, what was in this regard, but the law on state language is envisaged to regulate use of state language in social and other spheres. But I also would like to mention what was not said here, that in this law it is also adopted prolongation of the period of transitional period for law on education until 2023. So with this law, Ukraine implemented recommendation of the Venice Commission. And about other recommendation with regard to the private school, I would like also to say that Ukrainian government adopted and passed to the parliament this law on secondary education, where exemption of private schools is also envisaged. So we do what we promised, and we think really that it should be addressed on bilateral level, and it shouldn't be a reason for veto in NATO, because NATO is much more much more things to be covered, and it's first of all a main platform for cooperation in countering Russian aggression. And also, I have not but mentioned about some sentences. There are no Polish schools which were closed. In Ukraine, Bulgaria has no problem with our law on language. On April 19th, it was statement of Vice Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria, Madame Zakharova, who said that they are completely satisfied with law on education. We are in process of negotiation with Romania. We're still negotiating, but we are online, and we do hope that from this point of view we will be able, and we are open to have negotiations and to find a common understanding with our Hungarian friends, because, and I'm emphasizing with Hungarian friends, because we never saw in Hungary, we always saw in Hungary only friends, and from this point of view we understand that all disputes should be addressed in friendly manner. And I would like also to answer to this comments with regard to radical attitude of Ukraine and with regard to attacks to the Hungarian minority office. It is really very pity that always when we have mentioning about these cases, I can't hear about results of investigation, because first case with fire, it was investigated in Poland. There were Polish citizens, and it's already in court. And with regard to the second, persons are detained, investigation is ongoing. So I would like to reassure that we are against such attitude, and we are working, and we are to be able to address all the time this radical things, but in both attacks, not in first Polish radicals, which were connected with pro-Russian organization, in second persons from other regions of Ukraine, but also connected supposedly with Transnistrian organizers. So we can understand that it is not Ukrainian anti-Hungarian attitude. I can reassure you that we have no anti-Hungarian attitude in Ukraine, and it will not have place in further. And of course, the most important in the current situation things about Russian aggression. I think that here it is also important to mention that both candidates said that they will not give up until Ukraine regains its territorial integrity and peace. That we wait from Russia to stop fire, we propose, and even now they refused again the Easter ceasefire. Russian side refused it, not Ukrainian. So when we say that somebody is waiting from Ukraine that that presidential election will change situation, we are and we will be ready to change it, but it depends on Russia to change, because Russia must stop fire. Russia must withdraw its troops and weapons from Ukraine. They must return control over our border, and also to what is very important and emphasized by also by newly elected president and by current president, that we need our hostages to be released. And I also would like to mention two important things which were a little bit covered but not completely here. First is the situation in Black Sea, the Sea of Azov and Kerch Strait. We think that when in November last year Russia attacked our 3 military vessels, it was a new stage of aggression, and unfortunately we have to admit that now situation is not much more. Russia continue blocking normal movement of boats in this region. And we call on our partners to launch permanent monitoring mission in the Black Sea, Sea of Azov, and Kerch Strait to be able to prevent further deterioration of the situation. And very recent situation with yesterday's decree of Putin with regard to facilitation of giving Russian citizenship to Ukrainians living in occupied territories. We think that it is very, very important and very bad sign. Because if you look to the previous conflicts initiated by Russia, they use such a situation for further escalation and for further aggression. We should remember that according to the Russian legislation, they have right to use force, armed force to defend their citizens. So now they create their citizens to be able to use later even officially, openly force against Ukraine. So we called today meeting of UN Security Council, and we count also to strong position of all our partners and NATO, EU, of course, of Hungary in this context. And we think that it's not only necessary to condemn, but also to make further political and sanction pressure on Russia. We do support continuation of Normandy format, and it was said also by President-elected, and we also appreciate very much support of United States, of Mr. Volker's efforts in this regard, and we continue that it will be, and we hope that it will be continued, and we are ready for dialogue with Russia in frames of these formats and with facilitation of our partners. So I hope very much that with all these things we are able to find possibility to stop Russian aggression, and then Ukraine will be able to realize its dream to be part of European Union and NATO. And I would like also to say that both candidates and President-elected also said that he will stick to this main goal. By the way, 60% of Ukrainians support EU membership and 50% NATO membership. So there is huge support of these ideas as well. And I do agree that only Ukrainians can make Ukrainian nation big again, but we do need support from you in making it real. And I think that we do have right, as all other states, also to our Ukrainian identity. And civil identity is not replacing this one. It is because of this period of time, civil identity is so strong and helping state developing. But our national identity of Ukrainian state is equally important for us, like for Hungary, like for other states. And we do count on your further support in this. And thank you very much for being here and for being interested in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. We have basically run out of time, but we have discussed it with Mr. Volker. There is time for 3 one-minute questions, and I mean 1 minute, so I'll stop afterwards. Yes, first.
Thank you. István Szabadföldi, Hungarian Republican Society. I'm just amazed, you know, how history repeats itself. During the 70s and the 80s, when there was basically a cultural genocide in Czechoslovakia and Romania against the Hungarians, when the subordinated Kadar regime tried to unofficially raise these issues, you know, they were always suppressed by the Soviets, that they violate the unity of the Eastern Alliance, you know, the Warsaw Pact, and basically it was always refused. Now it seems to me that there is a change of roles, but the same request from all Western allies that you know, we should abandon in order to save the unity of NATO and the Western nations, the issue of the Hungarian minority defense of the Hungarian government. So how do you think can be this carried out, and why this kind of pressure is going on the Hungarian government? Thank you.
Second 1-minute question, and then the panel will answer afterwards. After 3 questions. If there is no other question, then they'll answer. Yes, there is one in the back.
Rádán Ébinger, Corvinus Egyetem, Budapest. Engedjék meg, hogy egy rövid megjegyzést tegyek az úgynevezett Golden Opportunity lehetőségéhez. Egy rövid párhuzamot vannék itt a régióban. 5 évvel ezelőtt Romániában egy német anyanyelvű, 100 származású elnököt választottak. A magyar nemzetpolitikának nagy reményei voltak, hogy milyen jó, meg fogja érteni a kinti magyaroknak, az RMDS-nek, stb. A politikáját. Sajnos ez hiú ábránnak bizonyult. Kérdésem, Zelenszky választott elnöknek a keze nincs ugyanúgy megkötve, mint Johannisnak a keze? Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you. Is there a third question? Van harmadik kérdés? Nincs. Yes?
Nagyon rövid leszek. A történelemsor azt mutatja, hogy ahol van egy szeparatista hajlam, önrendelkezési hajlam és komoly sérelmek, az mindig konfliktushoz, polgárháborúhoz, illetve külföldi hatalmak beavatkozásához vezet. Ahol a kisebbségi kérdés rendezve van, és nincsenek kérdések, például most Katalóniában, Spanyolországban, ott hiába van függetlenedési hajlam, nem vezet polgárháborúhoz, hogyha Katalóniában nem biztosítanák a megfelelő jogokat, valószínűleg polgárháborúnál tartanánk, de hogyha megnézzük az 500 év ír történelmét, az angol-ír viszonyokat, hasonló következtetésre jutunk. Mi erről a véleményük, hogy Ukrajnában nem-e a jogok biztosítása jelenti-e az orosz befolyás kiszorítását?
Okay, thank you. I'll give the floor to Kurt.
I didn't get the third question. Jó van, nagyon köszönöm szépen, és lehet, én magyarul fogok válaszolni elsősorban az első kérdésre, mert lehet, hogy nem volt tiszta, amit mondtam, amikor angolul mondtam. Mert a mi pozíciónk abszolút az ellenkezője, amit mondott. Azaz, hogy támogatjuk Magyarországon ebben, a kisebbségi kérdések fontosak, támogatjuk azt, hogy nemzeti kisebbséget saját nyelven is tudnak beszélni, még az oktatás is lehessen abban a nyelven is. Ugyanakkor ez normális, hogy egy ország azt akarja, hogy a lakosságot szintén a nemzeti nyelvet is beszéljenek, és szerintem ez a praktikus dolog, amin ki lehet tartani, hogyan lehet mind a kettő, hogyan létezhetnek mind a kettő egyszerre. És többfajta példa van Európában, ahol ez létezik. Szóval tisztán mondja, és Mizsai Kálmán szintén azt mondta, ez nem egy kétoldalú kérdés az, hogy vannak-e ezek a jogok elvileg. Ez egy európai kérdés, ez egy demokratikus kérdés, ez valami, ami az Egyesült Államok állandóan állt mögötte is. Hogyan lehet ezeket megvalósítani Magyarország, vagy a magyar kisebbség számára Ukrajnában, ez leginkább két oldalú módon lehet kitárgyalni, mert ez egy praktikus kérdés, nem egy elvi kérdés, ez egy praktikus kérdés, amin két demokratikus ország között lehet kitárgyalni.
Who wants to answer any of the questions?
Szeretnék mind a 3 kérdésről egy néhány szót mondani. Természetesen, kedves uram, neki igaza van, körülbelül így áll a helyzet, mi pedig azt szeretnénk, hogy érvényesülne az, hogy az Európai Unió és a NATO azok nem csak részben gazdasági szövetség, nem csak katonai szövetség, hanem egyfajta értékközösség is. és ez az értékközösségben pedig az emberi jogoknak nagy szerepet játszanak, és mindenfajta tekintetben nagy szerepet kell, hogy játszanak, mert nem mindegy az, hogy Ukrajnában az ukrán állampolgárok miért harcolnak. Miért halt meg 13 magyar a keleti fegyveres konfliktusban? Azért, hogy bezárják a magyar iskolákat, és ne lehessen még színházi előadáson sem magyarul beszélni? Vagy pedig egy európai demokratikus országért, ahol az emberi jogokat tiszteletbe tartsák. Azt hiszem, hogy ebben tisztabb hozat kell önteni a pohárba, és el kell mondani mindenfajta olyan államnak, amely Európai Unióhoz, a NATO-hoz csatlakozni kíván, hogy vannak olyan szabályok, amiket be kell tartani, és ezt el kell mondani, hogy ne alakulhasson olyan tévképzet ukrán vezetésben, hogy mindent meg lehet csinálni, arra hivatkozva, hogy fegyveres konfliktus van, illetve az, hogy a nyelvi jogok meg az oktatási jogok figyelmen kívül hagyása az európai érték. Szerintem nem az, és azért ezt hangsúlyozni kell. Amit a Klaus Iohannis és Zelenszky közötti hasonlóságot illeti, ez nincs így. Klaus Iohannis egy hányharmad, 80%-ban románok többség által lett megválasztva, és nem fogékony a kisebbségi jogokra. Viszont a közvéleménykutatási adatok szerint Zelenszky támogatóinak több mint a fele nem ért egyet az ukrán identitáspolitikával. Tehát Zelenszky, hogyha nem fog ebbe az irányba, vagy nem tud ebbe az irányba gesztusokat tenni, akkor elveszti a támogatóinak a többségét. Ez kétségtelen tény. Másrészt, amit szeretnék visszatérni arra azt, amit mondtam. Nagyon sürgősen lépéseket kell tennünk annak érdekében, hogy ne lehessen demagóg módon összekötni a nyugatpártiságot az etnicista politikával. Attól még, hogy valaki kiáll az emberi jogai mellett, attól lehet, sőt, kell is, hogy nyugatbarát és EU integráció és NATO integráció párti legyen. Ezt nem szabad összekötni, mert a későbbiekben a parlamenti választásokon ez az oroszbarát erőknek a támogatását fogja nagymértékben növelni, hogyha nem alakul ki egy olyan erős mozgalom és egy olyan erős párt Ukrajnában, amely összeegyezteti az EU és a NATO integrációt az emberi jogok, kisebbségi jogok védelmével. Erre Zelenszky esetében lehetőség van. Meglátjuk, hogy mi lesz, nem tudjuk, de erre lehetőség van. Természetesen egyetettek azt, hogy stabilitást Ukrajnában csak úgy lehet teremteni, hogyha a nyelvi jogokat, emberi jogokat tiszteletbe tartjuk. Alig képzelhető el Donetsk és Lugansk, a Krímnek a reintegrációja nélkül. Ez tény.
Yes. Anyone else? No. Then we don't have time to comment on anything, so I promised all the panelists that they could leave at 12. So I'd like to thank, first of all, the panelists. It's been an extraordinary panel, really world class, and also to the audience for patiently sitting through 2.5 hours. And there's a reward. The buffet lunch is served downstairs, so not in the adjacent room, but downstairs. Thank you very much, and I hope that we can continue on the subject.